This is Terms of Reference podcast number 152.
All of us know that data can lie, right? There's no real such thing as like truly objective data. All data is biased. But what we found that's been really amazing is that when there is information and data in front of people, and that people really understand where this data comes from, right? It doesn't just fall from the sky, but they do understand the limitations and that they're part of almost the creation of that data. There's this incredible thing that happens where there's quite a bit of desire to start working together to solve problems.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. How much do we really embrace failure in the social sector? I ask this question because, as someone who's been lucky enough to be a part of the evaluation revolution over the past decade, embracing failure at an institutional level still remains elusive. Organizations and individuals alike still remain reluctant to lay bare the shortcomings of their efforts for a number of reasons that go well beyond just the fear of losing donor funding or having a black mark on your CV. Unfortunately, I'm not here today with a clear-cut answer about how to embrace failure, other than doing so ultimately requires the same focus and discipline that you would apply to any other skill. You must not only specifically incorporate the recognition of failure into your planning and design, you must also be willing to practice it every day, ruthlessly. The good news is that, like so many other things, we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that if you can create this discipline and practice in your life, you'll learn faster, be more adaptable, and perhaps most importantly, the successes you do achieve will be that much sweeter. My guest for the 152nd Terms of Reference podcast, Nitya Ramanathan, is someone who definitely embraces failure. So much so that the organization she co-founded, Nextleaf Analytics, recently published an article that enumerated the company's failures for all the world to read about. Nextleaf focuses on how we can better use data to make a difference for those in need. More specifically, Nextleaf focuses on the use of low-cost sensors to improve things like cold storage for vaccines or cook stoves for rural families, among many other applications. But as you'll hear in just a few minutes, while data is important for Nextleaf, it isn't the true driving force behind their work. And this is where Nitya underscores in our conversation about the need to embrace failure and to continue to evolve your programs, processes, and even yourself. I spoke with Nitya in California. And before we get started, here's a quick word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Nitya. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really psyched to be here.
Nitya, I know from the research I did before the show that you have been traveling overseas looking at your projects. Do we find you still in India, or are you back home now?
Yeah, back in California, and kids are happily back at school. And
you are the president and co-founder of Nextleaf Analytics, and this is an organization I've been wanting to have on the show for a while, specifically to talk about your approach to data and your approach to analytics and how you're using those to help people in need. So why don't we start the show with how we always do, with you just telling us, what Nextleaf's all about and what your mission is.
Nextleaf started in 2009, and our focus is really on how do you help bring continuous, objective, real-time information to help accelerate the impact of organizations around the world. So our secret sauce is we focus on developing low-cost sensor technologies, and we think a lot about how should that data be used, and really when do you need information? Because most of the time, you actually don't need an expensive sensor. Most of the time, there's lots of other ways to get the information that you need. But what we saw earlier on was that too often a program would go through a design phase and would be implemented, and then there might be some sort of post-facto monitoring and evaluation cycle, but that information never really cycled back into the program. And so we thought a lot about how and when could real-time information make a big difference in the design and implementation and learning and iteration of programs.
So one of the things I love is that you're saying we thought a lot about it. Take me through the genesis of how things got started. Were you working at a different organization and you got together with colleagues and you started something new? Was this you sitting around a coffee shop and it just sort of popped out? Was there an aha moment? How did this all really get started?
my story starts where I love to start and end stories, which is in failure. So I'll tell you that story.
Awesome.
So I was finishing up grad school. I did a PhD in computer science, and my work was in monitoring water to understand arsenic in Bangladesh. And so that problem really, it didn't necessarily call for, but it did really benefit from having continuous sensor monitoring in rice paddies. And so I spent a number of years developing more robust sensor networks. This is back before wireless sensors and Internet of Things was a thing. So these were low power wireless sensors that could talk to each other in a rice paddy in Bangladesh, and then send data back to wherever we were in California at the time. And so I spent a number of years working on this problem, and it was very much within some of the poorest village communities in Bangladesh. And the communities there were so thrilled because the impacts of arsenic were very real for them. And so they were so, grateful that this scientist community had come to help them solve this problem. And I was there as part of a much larger collaborative, a multi-university collaborative that had been studying this problem and made real strides in understanding why arsenic was actually getting into the groundwater. But at the end of my project, when my funding was done and my publications had gone in, we were kind of done. And I was faced with this very stark reality that people that I'd gotten to know were still there drinking really bad water. And so I did something that I'm really embarrassed about, which is I raised some money and I helped to build a well. And it was purely to salvage my own sort of humiliation at being part of something that was, really not going to be solving a problem. And, of course, there's no question about how is this well going to be maintained, who could be trained to service it if there's a problem. People even know exactly how to keep it up or use it. And I didn't ask any of those questions, right? I raised this money, I built a well, and I sort of left. And it's one of the greatest embarrassments of my life, actually, just that I contributed to something so negligent in that way. And so that's really where this came from. So when I graduated, I did go on to become a faculty researcher, but that was never my passion. I was always interested in how do I really take what I've learned where there's really potentially great transformative value, but how do I think about this differently? And how do we do this whole thing differently so that we're part of larger systems that are built to last beyond funding and beyond the end of a so-called program? So that was really the genesis of Next Leap.
And then did you sit down with your two co-founders and say, hey, look, this is my idea for using sensor data, and here's how I think we could do it? Or was it more truly really iterative where you just sort of, shuck and jive, is like I like to say, you just sort of kind of just kept trying stuff till something worked out?
Yeah, that's right. Actually, we just continued to iterate until we found something that worked. So at the very beginning, no, we had my co-founder and I. So Martin and I were the very initial kind of co-founders before Ian joined. And Martin and I just kind of sat down in my garage and actually just started throwing some ideas around and just started putting the word out. And, we were really lucky that we had worked in a group that was very dynamic, very well known. And so it was pretty easy for us to start putting some feelers out and say, hey, we've got the skills, these expertise, done a couple of things, and we want to know what are some problems out there that people are having where they think that real-time information, wireless sensors could make a transformative difference to iterating on the program. And that was crucial for us because we were big hackers. My co-founder and I both were and continue to be really into trying things, learning, and improving. And so that's what we did when we started. We started with two of us. We just put it out there. We got lots of requests. Some of those requests came with money. Some of them didn't. That was really not important to us those first couple of years. It was a lot of all-nighters.
So let me riff on that for a second. When you say put it out there, what did this network look like? Was this truly just, whomever you could talk to and you're sort of ping-ponging off everyone? Or, it doesn't sound like there was a real conscious business development process, so is it just sort of this mix of people who had money, people who had good ideas, other organizations you talked to, or was it really just that eclectic, or was there more of a conscious effort towards it?
It was all of it. So I'll give you 3 examples. One organization that comes to mind, I can't even remember how these kind of initial contacts, in that first year, I really don't remember how these initial contacts came to be, but One organization was Island Conservation, run by Bernie Tershi, who started the organization some years ago, and really forward-thinking, really kind of innovative guy, and immediately understood what we were doing. He's a conservation biologist, was working on saving bird populations, and immediately got it. And so really early on, I remember he got us on a phone call and he was like, listen, we need to know when bird populations change. And we work on islands, they're really remote, so it's really hard to get out there. And we also know that the volume of the total bird calls actually is correlated to how many birds are on the island. So what can you do with that? And so Martin and I immediately were like, oh, yeah, we could put a cell phone in a box, we'll attach a microphone, and we'll power it with solar power, and let's just see what happens. And that was one of the first projects that we worked on, and it was fantastic. It was a great learning experience. We learned a lot about how you can design kind of low power, low cost sensors using off the shelf components for the most part. And, in order to enable quick, rapid prototyping. And, from there, we made a very joint decision to just open source the hardware because it wasn't going to be a solution that was necessarily going to scale right away and, kind of get to the types of impact that we were looking to make at the time. And so that was a really hard one to let go of. And actually still now to this day, every 2-3 months, somebody emails us to ask us to get back involved in acoustic monitoring for conservation. And it results in at least one 30-minute conversation in the office of should we not?
I was just going to say, you still have it on your website. I'm looking at it right now. It says wildlife acoustic monitoring. It's right there.
Yeah. No, it was just one of our favorite projects. Just, for the people who are involved, they're really smart, great people. And for the types of work and all the learning we got, we were really grateful. And so there's a number of projects like that. Another one came from my father. This was in cook stoves. And he had just launched a program called Project Surya. And this was to take a very different approach to clean cook stoves. So the problem being that about 3 billion people around the world breathe toxic air. This air kills them. This exposure to indoor air pollution kills more people than HIV, TB, and malaria. And it's just a massive problem. But the issue was that clean cook stoves as a solution have not been working for decades and decades. And there hasn't really been an ability to start from scratch and just iterate and say, we need a new data-driven approach to really understanding why things aren't working and start to iterate on the program. And so this was really interesting to us. And so we got started in a really small way. We developed a simple cell phone-based method to measure soot or black carbon in the air. And it was a really innovative approach, and we got a fair amount of attention and coverage for that solution. That method is still around, actually, it's been validated. But that ended up being the entry point where we really started learning and getting involved and ended up taking a strong leadership role in Project Surya that lasts to this day around how do you take real-time information and really use it to help iterate on programs. And so those are just two examples, but we got involved in lots of different programs, and we were really lucky to work with some really smart people in those early years.
So cook stoves is something that you highlight on your website. It's right there in one of the top menu items. It's a program that you've been involved with for a while now, but you also highlight vaccines. So before we go forward, I'd love to step back and say, so how did you get into the vaccine business? Was this just something you stumbled into as well, or was there another more conscious effort?
We really stumbled into it. So about 4 years ago, I was at a conference, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now. 5 years ago. I was at a conference and I was talking with a colleague of ours who's really a friend in the network, Josh Nesbitt from Medic Mobile. And he, also just really smart, thoughtful, creative guy. And we were at lunch and he just said, hey, so what are you guys up to? What are you doing? What are the latest sensors? So I was telling him, oh, hey, we've developed this low cost temperature sensor. We've been doing some really interesting things in cook stoves with it. But we really think that there's a lot more that could be done here. And temperature is a really great thing because it's pretty easy and cheap to measure. It's pretty easy to deal with. And unlike, putting sensors in rice paddies, which is really one of the hardest things that you can do with sensors. And so he said, well, you know about vaccines, right? They have to be kept cold. So I said, okay, tell me more. And he just started telling me about it and the challenges that Medic Mobile had seen through their work in last mile health centers in Kenya. So Medic Mobile's done a bunch of work there. And they had seen that the Ministry of Health had made it a real priority to try to start understanding the problem that they were having around keeping vaccines cold. So that was the beginning. And, from there, we really learned a lot about this problem in those first couple of months, looking at, okay, how often do fridges fail? Why do they fail? What prevents technicians from keeping them running? How do countries get money and resources to keep these refrigerators running if it's a priority? And ultimately, how do you ensure that when a child receives a vaccine, that vaccine has been kept cold and that it will work when it goes into that child's arm?
So the question I want to ask is, what are the barriers that you've encountered, right? I mean, so up to this point, we've kind of had a conversation around the things that you've accomplished, and it sort of seems like, hey, here we are, we sort of play in this maker space, and things just happen because of our network and whatnot. But I'm really interested in, what are the barriers, or what are the challenges that you guys keep running up against, or that you keep bumping your head into?
That's a good question. There's a number of them. So, it's interesting, given the work that you do, that we do, it often requires a lot of interaction with governments. And people always expect me to say that it's working with governments, looking to be part of a change process, that's the hurdle. And I know it sounds unbelievable, but that's one of the most gratifying parts of the work that we do, and some of the most rewarding and impactful sort of interactions that we have, where when presented with data, and, all of us know that data can lie, right? There's no real such thing as like truly objective data. All data is biased. But what we found that's been really amazing is that when there is information and data in front of people, and that people really understand where this data comes from, right? It doesn't just fall from the sky, but they do understand the limitations, and that they're part of almost the creation of that data in different ways. That there's this incredible thing that happens where there's quite a bit of desire to start working together to solve problems. I mean, almost everybody that we meet is ultimately a problem solver at heart. And the challenge is just being able to be presented with a problem that is tractable enough that we can make just a next step. So we don't have to solve it, but just make a next step. And the great thing about working with sensor data is that it is continuous, and it presents a picture. Sometimes it's not clear, but it presents a picture. And there's always this ability to actually come together and start pointing and start asking questions. And we find that, what's really interesting is that sensor data alone actually is never enough. You really need to have the bigger picture of people who are there, who with knowledge. But that when we have sensor data and we can say, well, we really see here that from, 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. every night, this fridge stops working. We can see that. You can see it in the temperature. You don't just have to rely on it. It gets people's juices going. Oh, you know what? I knew that there was a problem with that generator, and I just never saw it when I came in the morning. So I figured everything was fine, right? Like, it just starts eliciting these great kind of things where people start recalling all sorts of specific things that can be addressed. So the barriers that we face, I'd say, are much more in how money flows in the social sector. We're a great believer in ensuring that incentives are aligned, and that market-based solutions are in many instances needed. And, there's many problems that can't be solved by a market-based solution, but in many instances, sort of market-based solution is needed. And market-based doesn't have to mean sort of the free capitalist market, but that there has to be supply and demand, and there has to be a currency. Whatever that currency is, it has to be easily measurable. One of the challenges that we've had is that there's a real misalignment, because often in the sector, money may sometimes flow from a donor in a relatively top-down way to governments, and then governments may or may not agree with the sort of priorities that have been set. And then there's sort of partners who are funded by those donors who may have their own incentives and agenda. And so it becomes difficult to sort of ensure that everybody's going to work together, not only to implement a solution, but to ensure that that solution continues to work and ensure that that solution solves what the government needs. And so that's, I'd say, one of the biggest problems that we've seen in terms of kind of moving to scale, which is that ultimately you want to ensure that what you're delivering to the government is something that the government wants and will pay for and will sustain and keep going. And we find that when the thing that we're delivering, which is the thing that the donor has supported, is also the thing that the government really wants because it's solving one of their top three priorities, things really work. And there's quite a bit of enthusiasm and agreement, and everybody wants to work together. And it's a really exciting thing to be a part of. And so I'd say one of the challenges we've seen is when those funding streams are not aligned with the work and with the priorities, it gets really difficult to sort of, move the needle, so to speak.
You're a huge believer in the iterative process. And as we sort of gone through in this conversation, it's become quite clear that, trying and failing and fixing and trying and failing, fixing, that's something that you've really embraced as an organization. But is there a time when you've really just fallen flat on your face, where, you thought you had the right solution, you went out to the field and that just wasn't it? Like, could you take us through maybe one of those?
Yeah. So we have a really public one. We wrote this very widely received paper in Nature Climate Change, I don't know, maybe about 6 to 9 months ago. And we very publicly documented all of our failures.
Awesome. We have to get that paper on with the podcast. Awesome.
Yeah. It just to, kind of drive it home there that yes, we have faced many failures and we've been really public about that. So to give you a couple of examples, we are part of Project Surya. And Project Surya has been really, I think, forward-thinking in terms of pushing out there that we have to document failures. We have to know when things aren't working. And so a couple of poignant examples. One is there was an improved stove that was being evaluated and being considered for being used. And there was quite a bit of back and forth on whether that stove should be used or not. And we went through a field evaluation process, and it turned out that that stove was actually emitting more smoke than the traditional stove. So we learned from that as a iterative process, and we finally ended up with this other stove. And so the performance tested out great. We were all really excited about it. And the stove went out in the field, and it was used. It was bought by women through loans that they had taken out. And this stove ended up breaking all the time. And there was no real local supply chain. There was no real sort of process for how are we going to fix the stove? How are we going to address it? And this was in part of the earlier years of our involvement. And, again, I'm it's difficult to admit this, that, we were really green. We, didn't really have the experience to say, wait a second, hold up here. And this is the stove that did end up getting scaled up to several thousand homes, and that problem persisted. And so that was a real learning for us, is the more that we got involved in the program and saw this happening, the more mature that Project Surya got. We all kind of, came together and had to make a decision to actually wrap up the program and ensure that, women were able to pay off their loans and do a really kind of sort of difficult analysis of what were all the things that had gone wrong with that program, both the stove's robustness and the sort of process of scaling up and going, from 100 households to 1,000 households without having any really clear metrics of, what consists of success and how are we going to decide and agree that this program's ready to scale to 1,000. So anyways, lots of things we learned.
Yeah. So looking back on that, would there have been value in perhaps, partnering with a local NGO or working with the government in a different way? Or have you unpacked those lessons in a way that has now pointed you to, so let's say, for instance, the vaccines with the cold storage, was there lessons that you can immediately implement in there and learn from and hopefully not make the same mistake twice?
Yeah. So actually all of our work is always with the local partner, always, even back then. It's surprising to sort of see that there's not enough emphasis put on that supply chain, on ensuring that that entrepreneur who is equipped with, selling the stoves is also equipped and importantly incentivized to continue to fix the stoves. And so, that entrepreneur has to have training. They have to have a mechanism where they get paid when they do go and fix a stove. They have to have access to the spare parts. They have to have access to tools. The manufacturer has to be along for the ride. They have to commit to following through on their warranty. These are all the things that you'd be surprised when people say, yeah, there's a supply chain. There isn't necessarily all of these pieces in place. And so it's a big challenge, certainly, and one that we've really sort of experienced and learned the hard way, but one that's not documented enough. If you take any of the sectors that we're working in, our passion actually has been talking about maintenance technicians, whether it's a local entrepreneur or a fridge technician who works for the government. That's sort of our battle cry.
So again, I didn't expect myself to be asking this question in this particular conversation, but I think it's relevant in that you're sitting in California and we've had several people on the show from that neck of the woods. And I'm just wondering, how have you found the conversation with what, we traditionally call the Beltway, where, most of the focus of NGOs or the development sector, the social sector sits? I mean, what's been your dialogue with those organizations that sit there, and how have you found that conversation?
Surprising, honestly. We've learned so much. So probably one of the organizations that we've learned the most from is the World Bank. And that came as a surprise to me because, I came up as a Berkeley activist in college and, had all sorts of grand ideals about how things should work. And so it's been an incredible experience to learn and work with and iterate with the World Bank.
This is just me, of course, but when I think of the World Bank, I do not think of the word iterate. So, would you mind unpacking that for me a little bit? Have you found as an institution, the World Bank is really embracing this failure culture, this culture of let's try it and see if it fails and let's learn and let's go again, or?
I don't want to speak about things that I don't know about. So I definitely, let me answer what I can answer, which is that working with the organizations and the groups that we've gotten to work with within the World Bank, it's just been a fantastic experience. It's been getting to work with individuals that believe in iteration, that are very comfortable with failure. Actually, from what I can tell, these are individuals who control and deploy really large sums of money and have to be very thoughtful and make decisions on imperfect information and really seem to take learning very seriously, perhaps likely because, the sums of money are quite big. And, it's really about for them analyzing risk and then, putting things out there and learning and iterating. And, like I said, I can't speak for the whole organization. I'm talking about a couple of individuals that we've worked with.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I mean, the World Bank is a giant organization, and your interactions with them are going to be different than other people's interactions, et cetera, and the organization as a whole. And now that I'm really thinking about it, I have to eat my own words from earlier because we've had at least two, if not more people, I think actually three people on this show specifically who have absolutely exemplified the idea of understanding the importance of data and iteration and learning from failure and constant involvement. So that really tracks with your experience and what you found with working with the World Bank as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the World Bank's embracing of results-based financing. And, I think the jury's out on, is results-based financing going to be the answer? But, in certain instances, it certainly is going to be effective. And, I think the World Bank is really in an interesting position where they seem to have really oriented a lot of the thinking towards results-based financing in different forms and getting objective data from programs in order to evaluate whether impact metrics have been met. I think the challenge that the World Bank will have, if I, may speak frankly and in my own humble opinion, is that it's hard to measure results and impact at large scale in a way that is going to be as objective and sort of accurate as it would be at smaller scale. I mean, that's the reality. And I think the World Bank is doing a really good job in that, intractable problem of saying, okay, well, let's put some frameworks in place. And this is what we've had the chance to do with some of the cook stove work with the World Bank. And so we've gotten a chance to kind of get some really cool insights into how they do think about risk and investment. I mean, for me, yeah, it's incredibly encouraging actually, because there's absolutely room to iterate and learn and improve and take the data and fold it back into programs. And so it's been a really sort of unexpected and very positive experience for us to be part of something like that.
So is there anything that NextLeaf is working on right now that is starting to cross over into what we'd call standard ops or institutionalization, or something that, people are just saying, oh yeah, this is just the way we do it? I mean, and I'm thinking about, we've been lucky enough recently to have the Mulago Foundation, which is one of your former funders, Dr. Kevin Starr, on the show. And that's something that they really focus on, right? Is like, how do you have lasting change happen over a longer time? And so coming back to that question is there something that NextLeaf is working on? Maybe it's the cook stoves, or is it the vaccines, where this is a process you've put in place that is really, you can see this making a difference for a very long time. And
first of all, can I just say that Kevin Starr is one of my favorite people. He's amazing. Yeah. Oh man, he's just brilliant. A really quick side story. I met Kevin really early on, maybe within our first year of this journey. he really called it. So the mission statement that I shared with you is actually the mission statement Kevin helped us, basically wrote within like 5 minutes of meeting me. At the time, I was like, what? No, Kevin, we help monitor birds. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about. But he just like connected the dots in this insane way. I mean, the guy is really, he's a genius. I have no other way of saying that. I mean, he's a really good friend of mine. I'm so lucky to be able to say that. But yeah, he's so great. So, our mission statement, we didn't use the mission statement he gave us until literally a couple of months ago, honestly. So it was funny to try out that mission statement when I said it, because we didn't fully get what he meant until literally a couple of months ago.
So forgive me for a second. I'm going to get a little esoteric here for a second, but this is something that we hear talking about all the time, right? Where it's financing for results, it's iterative development, it's, constant improvement. But this is something that the private sector has been doing for a very, very long time, or forever, really, right? It's make sure that we're constantly improving and that we're able to take those steps forward and not essentially, burning the ground behind us as we do it. But that's something that we need to embrace in the social sector. And it's starting to happen, but it seems like, why haven't we made that leap? Or why is it such a difficult leap for us to make? And why do we keep separate that out? I mean, maybe I just gone on the deep end there, right? But do you have a thought on that?
It's a really good point. And that is definitely a struggle, but I think that's a really good one, because I think, we find that level of accountability both terrifying, but also, it's where our creative juices really get going. But yeah, it's really tough. I'd say, what we try to do is be really, really forthright upfront about the risks. And we try to make really clear that, yes, here's all of the things that we're doing. Here's the reasons why the results may not be delivered. Here's what we're going to try to do to mitigate those. And yet still, there's reasons that this may not happen. And so we try to really do that education upfront so that there isn't a feeling of bait and switch. I think we've been really lucky to work with partners and funders and government partners that really have been supportive. And maybe it's self-selecting. I couldn't really say why, but I mean, Malago Foundation and Gavi, Gates Foundation, Google. I mean, we've really been lucky to work with people who are really supportive of iterating. But no, what you're saying is exactly what keeps my team up at nights, is this constant fear of like, okay, this time it may not work. And, we're going to have to just hope like hell that as we communicate results or lack of results to all the partners, that everyone's along the ride with us. And so it is a terrifying thing. And just to kind of go back to your previous question, I would be really disappointed if the standardization of what we've done kind of came in at the level of, maybe we should include a sensor. Because I've seen a lot of that happen. And it's really the wrong question to ask, honestly, because sensors are their own thing. They need their own supply chain. And you referenced this early on. And we've seen that in India. We're working at scale in India. We've installed our sensors, as part of a government rollout program in 1/3 of all the health centers, which is massive scale, about 7,000 clinics. And we've really seen the challenges of providing the supply chain just for the sensors, let alone then starting to get involved in the refrigerators and ensuring the vaccines stay safe. So, we think a lot about standardization and scale, a lot about that. So a couple of examples where we have found that it's effective. One is we helped develop one of the ISO standards for cook stove monitoring. So there was a group that was put together by the Global Alliance of Clean Cook Stoves to develop standards, ISO standards. So these are international standards. And we were part of a small contingent that fought really hard to say, these standards, we need these for field measurement along with laboratory testing. And so we ended up taking the lead on the development of the ISO standard for field measurement and, really got a chance to have some really difficult conversations with a large international group of experts that ended up resulting, I think it just got signed in a couple weeks ago, into practice. So now, how these standards actually get used and what will be the real impact, I think we won't know for quite a while. But we are a great believer in standardization when things are ready, in order to kind of get to that faster kind of adoption. It's going to be a lot easier for people to just point to this ISO standard and just say, okay, I know I need this information. I know I need to iterate on this program, and I'm just going to point to this and grab some best practices. The other area where standardization is really crucial, and we push for this a lot, is when you have multiple information systems serving a government. So health systems are complicated. Governments have, a number of different information systems, some online, some not, to help manage all the data that they're dealing with. And we're a huge believer in needing interfaces that are open and published in order to have these different systems talk to each other. And this is something that the World Bank realized way early on in the work that we were doing with them, and also went on to support that work, by the way, which, it's one thing to say it's important and another to say, okay, we're going to support the engineering dollars needed to create those interfaces of interconnection. So yes, huge believer in standardization, or not standardization per se, but, getting sort of agreed upon methodologies and frameworks. And we've done actually quite a bit of that work, even though that's never been part of our mandate, and certainly never been part of the initial kind of agreements with programs, but we've seen real need and benefit for it. So we spend quite a bit of time there, actually.
Yeah, so just to draw us back maybe towards, where we were going with data for results or whatever, but it's about the ecosystem, right? You're there with your lab and you guys are putting out great products and services, and that's where you want to stay focused on. But at the same time, you have to contribute to that conversation about making sure that people are protected and that there is a supply chain and that everything continues to play together. And then also at the same time, you've got requests coming in for your time to speak at conferences, and I'm sure there's a ton of private sector organizations that are like, hey, how can we use what you're doing as well? And so it really is finding that balance of where do we fit, not only where do we fit, but then how do we best add value, and where do we want to spend our time participating in that ecosystem? Does that track well with your thinking?
Yeah, no, it's a real challenge. And I mean, I'm a great believer in bringing private sector efficiencies to solve not all, but certain problems in the social sector. One thing that I think doesn't map directly is this commitment that's required from social entrepreneurs to contribute to the ecosystem. We need to build this ecosystem because we're trying to operate in it. We're trying to create these new markets. We're trying to create change systems that didn't necessarily exist or modify them. And so we have to contribute to the ecosystem. It's not like a quid pro quo thing. It's just the way it has to be. And I've seen that, straight private sector companies that are in some of the spaces that we're in, I've seen that that's been, a real lack there. And it's, I think, part of the reason why Nextleaf has in the spaces where we've had, some scale and impact and success, I think that's been a big difference, honestly, is that we think so much about the ecosystem. When we put a sensor in a fridge, we don't just sell somebody a sensor and install it and walk away. I mean, we sit down and we think about, wait a second, why didn't the maintenance technician come? Yeah, hang on a second. That technician was supposed to be here. Like, what happened? Why didn't he have the truck? Oh, wait a second. And like we really constantly, we're digging into these things that, maybe a traditional company might see as a rat hole, but for us, it's sort of the path to impact. So hugely agree with what you're saying.
So where do you see Nextleaf going in the next 2-3 years or so? Because, maybe you're going to wake up and you're not going to be a sensor organization anymore, but what's the near-term future look like for you?
So one area we're starting to explore that we've been, really we've been sort of let into this sector, I'd say, is agriculture, and looking at how to help reduce post-harvest loss of food, because this has implications for food security, potentially for smallholder farmer livelihood, potentially climate change, all sorts of implications. And so looking at what is the contribution of the cold chain? So what is the contribution of proper refrigeration to this type of loss? And there's lots of really fascinating offshoots to that question. How do you help farmers, develop coffee that is actually, of export quality? What is the role of refrigeration and proper humidity there? These are just things we're just starting to ask about and learn about. And, we've been, sort of invited to some really fantastic conversations to start bringing the learnings that we've developed. It's been really fun to, start where we were maybe 5 years ago on the cold chain for vaccines, but be able to have really different conversations. And this is going to be both the challenge and the blessing, where, we're no longer just a couple guys in a garage, like, writing code and all-nighters. We do have a bit of a brand, and we've worked really hard to create that brand. As we kind of enter into this next phase, I'm really interested to see how myself and my team and the technologies and all of us are able to continue failing and being really public about that. So I definitely aim to work towards ensuring that as we enter into ag, for example, that we continue to, kind of make spaces for failure and not feel the burden of our, kind of successes make it too difficult to continue to fail, because that's when, we've kind of lost the game.
We've talked a lot about failure, but how do you know when to walk away? Is there something that you use at NextLeaf as a criteria to say, we know that this is no longer going to be valuable for us to take forward, and this is our decision point, this is our criteria?
That's a great question and a really hard one. We're still learning. So, when we walked away from monitoring bird populations, that was a really long, drawn out process, and it was not easy. And we
don't like putting our babies to bed, right? Right.
Yeah. So, we're trying to get better. I've got one guy on my team who's been really disciplined about saying, we got to just set some metrics and we've got to stick to those. And, if a partner's not delivering, a program's not delivering, a technology's not delivering, somebody on our team's not delivering, then, you do your due diligence, you really work with them, you work on rehabilitation. And then at some point, you have to be willing to stick with those metrics. And so, it's not quite so rigid as that, but I do think that level of discipline has been really good for me to, think about and kind of set things up front and set some expectations and make those expectations public, whether it's public to my team or public, so that it kind of helps us stay accountable to those agreements that we make with ourselves and with others. But yeah, it's really hard. It's hard to say no to opportunities. I would love to, get involved in ag and look at how do you monitor safe roads and water and safe cities and outdoor air pollution. And there's just like so many things that we're dying to learn more about. But ultimately, we are a product company and we are trying to deliver a product at scale. And so it's been a really important thing to be able to say no. And honestly, I don't think that I'm good at that. And I'm, it's one of my shortcomings as a leader that I really look to my board.
So the last two questions I have for you, Nitya, are ones that I ask every guest on the podcast now. And so this first one is, who do you pay attention to? What news sources do you pay attention to? Blogs, Twitter feeds, magazines, other data sources, other sources of information that you use to stay fresh, to keep up to date, to stay informed?
I love conversations with my network of advisors and mentors. For me, I always, say this, that none of this would have happened without a network of people who really believed in us before we had a clue about what we were doing. And so for me, it really is conversations with, folks like Kevin Starr, who is sort of push us and challenge us and hold us accountable, but always bring a different question, a different perspective. That's always been really energizing for me. And then the second is, being able to be in contact with the communities that we're serving. So, whether it's nurses in clinics, governments, women who use clean cook stoves, that's ultimately what just keeps me sort of grounded. And I know it sounds so trite and so lame and, but it's really the only thing that kind of keeps me going, because honestly, I've become a little bit of a paper pusher, just with the size of our organization and all of that. And so it's just such a blessing when I get to actually spend a little bit of time with people that we're trying to serve.
So my last question is honestly my favorite one, but across our conversation here, you've talked about a ton of different organizations and things that you're excited about, but is there a particular organization or process or solution or technology or something out there, and maybe not a shiny new object, but something that you're super excited about, not necessarily related to your work, that you'd like to get a shout out to right now?
Yeah, there is. That's like the easiest question. I mean, there's so much amazing stuff out there. I think the process and a couple of organizations that I've actually been trying to set up calls with over the next couple of weeks, because I'm just dying to meet the people behind these, are people who are really developing market-based solutions for delivering high-quality water. So people who are asking the question, it's not enough to just say, I got water to people. I need to ensure and prove to myself and prove to everybody that this water is clean and is actually going to save lives. And so there's two organizations that, I'm just starting to kind of learn about. One is Saha Global. They work in Ghana, I think. And then the other is DLO Haiti. Two sort of, and God, I hope I'm not, sort of misrepresenting how they would talk about it. But, from what I've read and talked with other people about, two organizations that are, really focusing on scalable market-based solutions to get clean water to organizations. And, the Hilton Foundation, who I just got a chance to speak with, which is really trying to support these types of, market-based solutions to getting clean water out there. And, really focusing on how do you incentivize the entrepreneur? How do you ensure that that last mile supply chain is going to be there? How do you ensure that, when the pump breaks, there's somebody who's paid to fix it? I mean, all these things that are just not sexy and not fun to talk about, but that I see as being the real crux of bringing solutions. It's not the newest and latest and greatest. I think innovation is really going to come in efficient delivery of whatever it is that we're talking about. And whoever cracks that will have the key. And I'm just dying to meet those people who seem to have started to, find some solutions out there. Yeah, that's what I'm psyched about.
Nitya, thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation, and I hope we'll stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate the chance to kind of chat with you. And I'm always happy to continue this conversation with folks who are listening.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.